welcome to My Tiny Bottles, the project where I'm exploring my grandmother's legacy of miniature liquor bottles, one tiny bottle at a time. I'm your host, Tammy Coxon, and my guest today is Noah Rothbaum. We are at Amoria Margot, thanks to Southerteak for letting us use this space for shooting. And Noah, I know you best, I think, from your variety of podcasts with Dave Wondrich.
Yes.
But where else are you? What else have you been up to?
Sure. Dave and I hosted a podcast called Life Behind Bars for a number of years, and then one called Fix Me a Drink. So we do that with Flaviar, and I'm also the author of several books, The Business of Spirits, The Art of American Whiskey, the forthcoming Whiskey Bible, which will be out in 2025 if I finish it. And I'm also the associate editor of the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails. Dave was obviously the editor-in-chief of that. I am a fellow of the James E. Beam Institute, the University of Kentucky. It's a long way of saying I get paid to drink for a living. So it's
and it sounds like you know a thing or two about
I know a thing or two.
whiskey,
Yes,
having actually written a book on it. So I did ask you. I sent you a list of what bottles I had available to taste, and you said, "Oh, maybe the Jack Daniel's or the Wild Turkey." In the end, came down on the Wild Turkey.
Well, I mean, I think Wild Turkey is particularly wonderful whiskey, but also has a local connection because, we think of Wild Turkey today as, one of these staples of Kentucky, right? Mm-hmm. Of Jimmy Russell and his family making the whiskey forever down in, Bluegrass State. But in fact, I like to say that Wild Turkey is actually a Brooklyn brand because it was originally a brand created by Austin Nichols, which was based in Brooklyn. They had a house whiskey that was made by the Rippies, which is which ultimately becomes the Wild Turkey Distillery. One of the executives from Austin Nichols goes on a hunting trip with friends. They had a house whiskey. They were drinking that. One of his friends, follows up and says, "Oh, I'd love some of that Wild Turkey whiskey."
Right.
The light bulb goes off, and then they create Wild Turkey. But again, I mean, its roots are really in Brooklyn, not in Kentucky. It's always been made in Kentucky, obviously, but it's something that was sort of the idea was started in the 5 boroughs, which I love.
That is really interesting. And that's like that time period where we think about distilleries as selling whiskey today. Yes. But in that time, it was much more common for people to buy and blend and,
Sure. And I mean, obviously, a lot of that still goes on today where, there's plenty of brands, buying whiskey from, the large distilleries in Indiana, MGP, or other places. Wild Turkey, the Rippies obviously sold plenty of whiskey to different folks over the years. But it's kind of exciting always to try, an earlier version of an old favorite. Obviously, whiskey, production, processes, grains, ingredients, change over time. So I'm particularly excited for this. And this one says what? It says it's an
8-year-old,
which I know Jimmy Russell, who's the master distiller of Wild Turkey, and has been
and was at this time,
and was his now son Eddie, and his grandson Bruce Russell now works for the brand. But that was probably several years older than the modern version of Wild Turkey 101, and I think just shows the fact that at that time you could buy an 8-year-old Wild Turkey for probably not very much money.
$1.50.
$1.50. So, and it looks like it has a
Tennessee tax stamp.
Okay, so bought somewhere in Tennessee for who knows why, but
right. We have to bring back to grandma, right? Like that was the thing. People wherever they traveled, they would grab a mini for grandma. I did it as a kid. We'd pick out the one with the hat or the one that looked the most fun.
And kind of always the Wild Turkey 101, even during sort of the dark ages of whiskey, was always sort of, well known. The 101 proof was always a signature, sort of novelty, but I'm excited to try it.
Yeah, me too. So I think it says 1979 on the bottle, and so usually we assume things were liquid was put in there within about a year.
Is there a date on the tax stamp too?
No date on the tax stamp.
Okay.
Nope, just Wild Turkey. And then, so I used the tax stamp decoder ring to kind of match the date on the bottom. Because if we'd gotten to 82, the tax date, this would look different. So pre-82 for sure. All right, so here we go. Always exciting. So this hasn't been opened before, and you can see it's got a little bit of evaporation going on, but definitely not the worst bottle I've seen for that.
So we're roughly 43, 45 years
Amazing. 43
in this tiny bottle.
Years in this tiny bottle.
Ooh.
Smells good.
Smells like wild turkey.
It does. This is the first bourbon that I've tasted. I've tasted some of the scotch already, but I haven't tasted any of the bourbon. My grandma famously didn't like bourbon.
Oh.
Yeah, so she'd come to the States and she'd order a whiskey sour, which in Canada meant Canadian.
Right.
Right? And so then she'd get a whiskey sour with bourbon here and she'd like...
She wouldn't like
she'd
it.
not like it.
Well, I mean, for us, for our sake, I'm glad that she didn't like bourbon so that we could try this wild turkey.
She didn't drink any of the minis, though.
Right.
The minis were just for collecting. No. My dad and my grandmother have a debate over whether she'd be really happy that I was doing this, or my dad and my aunt have a debate over whether she'd be really happy I'm doing this or be rolling over in her grave that I'm drinking her tinies.
Well, cheers to...
Cheers.
To Grandma.
Wow. That 101 proof really comes through.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it will be interesting when we pour it next to the modern one, but it definitely tastes different. Like, I mean, maybe it's...
Than your recent recollections.
Yeah, absolutely. There's like almost like a slight charcoal note, right? Like it's a little, obviously a little bit more viscous, which probably is because of the evaporation.
Right.
But like, there's like a richness, like wild turkey definitely was known back in the day for a real kind of richness and a roundness. Like some of like the original Russell's Reserve bottlings, which, you know, were done because they thought Jimmy was going to retire. You know, this was 20 odd years ago, obviously.
Jimmy's never going to retire.
Nobody asked Jimmy because he didn't retire. But those had like a real kind of amazing richness. They re-released some of that whiskey a few years ago. I think it was $600 a bottle.
Wow.
I mean, that was the retail. God knows what the bottles now go for in the secondary market.
Is there anything about like distilling technology? Like, is this like there's more esters, more like fatty acids coming through because things have changed?
I mean, not really difference between probably 79 and today, right? But there are, you know, since, you know, wild turkey has gone through many hands in the last 40 years, right? So, you know, it was owned for a while by Pernod Ricard, and now obviously it's owned by Campari, the large Italian spirits company, and they've built like a a new distillery, and they have redone the distillery, warehouses. So, I mean, that's definitely different. So it's you know, I mean, it's in the same physical location, but it's been redone. Obviously, American whiskey, you know, really since after Prohibition has always had to be aged in a new oak barrel. So it's always a new oak barrel that's been charred. So, I mean, most of these things should stay consistent. I imagine the still technology, it's always been a large column still, like in the modern era. It's not like some of the brands, you know, like something like Jack Daniels was actually made back in the day on a chamber still. Okay. So, you know, that's a huge change, you know, but that's... Your grandmother would have had to get a mini in like the 1890s.
Yeah, she's not that old.
Okay, yeah, little jug maybe. Or should we try the modern version?
Yeah,
I think this one obviously needs some time to open up too, and maybe pour a little bit of water into it.
Just get around that 101.
Yeah. Well, or just to open it up.
Yeah.
It's like there's a chemical reaction that happens when you add water to whiskey. Sort of opens up sometimes the aromas, the flavor notes.
So
you can already kind of tell, like with the little bit of water, that it's changed a little bit, where it's opened up, and it's 45 years. Obviously, this will never not be an 8-year-old. I mean, this is not a 53-year-old. Yeah. It's an 8-year-old that's been in a bottle for 45 years.
And how much does that make a difference?
Well, I mean, it sort of depends upon where it was stored. Like,
not well.
Not right. I mean, how, you know, was it next to the clothing dryer? Was it above the oven?
It was on a wall.
The kitchen? Like,
you know, not protected from light.
Right. Was sunlight hitting it every day? I mean, you obviously, we all know the effect of sunlight on wallpaper,
Right.
curtains.
Label color's pretty good, so it probably was in the shade. You know, I think the tax stamp would fade out quite a bit in the bright.
Yeah, and the fact that it had never been opened, obviously.
Yeah.
Like the less whiskey or any spirit in a bottle, the quicker you have to drink it because there's more air. So let's try the modern version.
The old one definitely has more nose.
Yeah.
Much like richer kind of. There's an undercurrent of something that's the same.
And I imagine that this is the 8-year-old is older than what they're bottling today as the 101.
Right. I went to a Wild Turkey Behind the Barrel thing, and they were saying 6 to 8 years is kind of their sweet spot. But I know that whiskey right now is really, there's not enough bourbon to meet demand.
But what's interesting with this 8-year-old is that, you know, I remember talking to Jimmy Russell about this about 20 years ago, and like in that age range, 6 to 8 years, if I remember correctly, was kind of his gold standard. Like he didn't want to age his whiskey much longer than that. Obviously now, you know, the zeitgeist is, you know, 15, 20, 25-year-old whiskey and commanding, you know, hundreds, if not thousands or tens of thousands of dollars if we're talking about Pappy Van Winkle.
Yes.
So that, you know, but this is like, this 8-year-old is you know, in this sort of golden age of whiskey in the modern one anyway, was more of an idea of what people wanted or the distillers wanted, right?
Yes, and you know, I think this is very much Jimmy's vision, right?
Yeah.
Like even today, he's like, you know, I've heard him on podcasts, like, what's up with all these ryes and things? Like, I want this bourbon, right? This is what it should taste like.
I mean, that's also one of these things where back in the day, like, you know, most brands make rye and bourbon today.
Right.
Where back in the day, people were either rye drinkers or they were bourbon drinkers. There's like a big article that I read in the New York Times when like Harry Truman became the president of the U.S. and suddenly D.C. was a bourbon town.
Oh my God!
And people were losing it because like bourbon, you know, now is, you know, synonymous with America, but for a long time that, you know, rye was really what we were known for. And bourbon was only, you know, drunk in certain areas. So, you know, I think what we don't realize is that in like the 70s, the whiskey market really had this giant crash and things got so bad that even though the bourbon distillers really hated the rye distillers and rye itself, they were willing to save the rye brands. They bought the intellectual property and began making rye in Kentucky, where Wild Turkey has, you know, a rye. They needed to do it just because they could like just eke out a little bit of revenue that they so desperately needed because, you know, nobody was really buying whiskey overall. So, you know, even if they could just sell a little bit of rye to the folks in the mid-Atlantic states, they would. So, I mean, that just shows how bad things were that they were willing to essentially make their rival. I'm sure Jimmy would have been happy for rye to completely disappear. And, you know, the fact that his grandson, Bruce, we did an event here not far from here. Bruce is obsessed with rye whiskey. And, you know, when, you know, Bruce will order rye, like Wild Turkey rye or Russell's Reserve rye, and just Jimmy, like his look of sadness and a little bit of disgust, you know, kind of comes across his face. Like, why would you drink that? Like, in front of me, like kind of, you know, like how they have bourbon here, you know, right? Like, why would you do that?
A few years ago, I was doing a bourbon tasting and we said, oh, give us that other one to try. And the bartender put it down and I tasted it. And I was like, wait, Andy, was that the bourbon or the rye? He's like, oh, that's the rye. And that's the moment I realized my favorite bourbon is rye.
Right. So. Well, I mean, it's some companies too, like the difference between making bourbon and making rye is very small. Or obviously to make bourbon it has to be 51% corn and rye it has to be 51% rye. So, you know, some of the high rye bourbons are very close to, you know, you don't get that much of a difference, obviously, between some of these things.
Well, the modern one is so much thinner.
Yeah, I mean, the 8-year-old one, really, you're getting to see sort of that full complexity of the Wild Turkey signature flavor, right? I mean, it's so rich. Like the depth of the flavor is incredible.
It smells so good.
You get, I mean,
a lot of toffee, caramel notes coming out now. It's been sitting here, the old one. I'm sniffing the old one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's maybe oxidized slightly this
Hmm.
bottle, but you still get that kind of signature wild turkey flavor. And there are a few modern brands that really have that. Michter's, I think, has
Okay.
worked really hard, right? They do things like lower barrel proof, so it would not surprise me. I know Jimmy is a fan of that. It would not surprise me if they were putting the whiskey in at a lower barrel proof into the barrels, like back in the day, because obviously, the higher the proof that you put into the barrel, you're mixing it with water, so the more whiskey you wind up with. But at the time in the late 70s, 80s, that wasn't really an issue because you
Right.
could barely sell what you were making, so you could put it in at a lower barrel proof, which is more flavorful, right? So folks like Michter's do that today.
Hmm.
My friend Todd Leopold out in Denver, his three chambers still. There's something about the three chamber still is wildly inefficient, but it's wonderful at making flavorful whiskey, right?
I've had their collab with
Oh yeah, with
George
the
Dickel, and
absolutely.
oh my God, so good.
And when I tasted, when Todd sent me some of his earliest samples for the three chamber still, I said, this immediately. I said, this tastes to me kind of like the old wild turkeys. And he said that Chuck Cowdery said the same thing. And
Oh, that's
there's
interesting.
something about the way that, while the technology wasn't different per
Hmm.
se, they were using it in a different manner to
Yeah.
make, like, even I would argue even more flavorful whiskey back in the day when, you had the time and the freedom to do that. Where
Right.
now, the demand is so overwhelming for American whiskey. These distillers are running, 24/7, 365. So like, it's about production.
I'm sure they would have loved to have that level of
Oh
demand
my
in the
God.
70s. I wonder, I mean, I know you said, Jimmy's like sweet spot was that 6 to 8 period, but, since age statements are minimums, this could actually have older whiskey in it potentially
For
if
sure.
because they had so much
And
extra at that
sometimes
point.
that
Yeah.
that was done. I mean, sometimes you would, you get a whiskey and you're like, this is definitely way older than what it
Hmm.
says on the label, but I mean, sort of really no way of telling.
Right.
But at the same time, like both Jack Daniels and Wild Turkey were some of the few whiskey brands that were still really well known and really, in demand. So, they were able to weather the storm,
Yeah.
but just barely, but they were able to do it.
Well, thank you so
Oh
much
my
for
God.
joining
Oh, it's
me.
my pleasure.
Where can people find you?
I'm on, obviously on the internet. Dave and I are a podcast, Fix Me a Drink. The old episodes, we have almost 100 or over 100 episodes of Life Behind Bars that
I've
are still
listened
out
to
there.
every single one.
Wow. Well, thank you
Yeah.
for doing that. So it's a lot of time. There are a lot of good episodes. We did do one, I think, of Fix Me a Drink with Eddie Russell not that long ago. So about the history of wild turkey. And obviously, the art of American whiskey is the visual history told through old label art, bottle design, and then the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails are both out now. Look out for the Whiskey Bible, which will have
That's
even
really
more of these
exciting.
stories and
That'll
cover
probably
a
help
lot
my
more.
research a lot of those little
Absolutely, it'll be a
bottles. I
lot
spend a
easier.
lot of time looking up things on the internet and finding, right, listening to
Right,
episodes and yeah, to
right.
get those little tidbits. Well, thank you so
Oh
much for
my,
joining me. Cheers.
cheers.